Well, hey now, welcome to Fitz's Electric Bar. A little bit of gaps between my postings. If I'm not feeling it, I'm not going to be doing videos. And yeah, haven't been really feeling it lately, but really looking forward to kind of talking about something that I found quite moving. And it's just one of these immersive experiences I get where I will read a biography or an autobiography by a musician usually, and it will put me into a deep immersive mode where I'm listening to their records. I'm, loving reading about their lives, what was going on. And one of the things I think I love about all of this is because I read so many music biographies, and I start to see the scenes kind of from different perspectives. So, for example, when you think about, let's say, New York City and the kind of the birth of punk, having read Thurston Moore's autobiography, having read, I think it was a book called Buildings on Fire, which is about music scenes in New York, different kinds of scenes, but included the CBGB scene, which was one that I could relate to. I only went to CBGB's once while it was an operating bar and saw Fishbone there, and that was great. And it was great to have experienced that. But anyways, I digress. When you hear about different times in our musical history and popular music, and you hear the stories from different perspectives, you hear stories that are familiar to you, but also from another perspective and another angle. And so I just recently finished reading, long preamble, Patti Smith's Bread of Angels. And any of you who are Patti Smith fans know that she's quite prolific, both as a poet and writing, I guess, prose or nonfiction, I think. I was surprised and not surprised by the number of things that she's put out. I remember Babel, a book of poetry. Many of us who are Patti Smith fans are familiar with Just Kids. And I really enjoyed that book. It was really the story about her relationship to both Robert Mapplethorpe and New York City and kind of that era in the early 70s, early to mid 70s, I guess. And a wonderful book about that time in her life. This one, in case you're interested, I think this is a great read. And this one covers a lot of her early youth, like basically growing up in New Jersey and the experience of being one of, I think, 4 children, I think. Her parents and the upbringing and what kind of home life it was and things like that. To be honest, those kinds of, almost like backstories or the things that help shape the artist, I recognize the value of those because we are, whether we're artists or we're just human beings walking this earth, we are shaped by the environment that we grew up in, nature versus nurture, right? So there is who we are in terms of our nature, but there's the way that we were brought up, the values, the things that we were exposed to, all that kind of stuff does shape us. But for some reason, when I'm reading this for even artists that I really love, like, Strummer and things like that, I find I need to kind of blow through that stuff fairly quickly unless it's really written in a way that really transports me. I think of Patti Smith as an artist. What makes an artist who both writes and creates music? Well, to me, that is somebody who doesn't give a fuck about what people think. What I mean by that is that they're going to put out what they're going to put out. When the marketing forces say you've got to do this to promote the record or whatever, it's not that you're just saying no to everything or that you're let's say, biting the hand that feeds and say, I'm not going to promote it, but not doing anything that does not feel genuine to the art that you're creating. And people like Dylan, like Neil Young, and I think Patti Smith is very firmly in that camp, they create what they want to create, audience be damned. So they don't create music thinking this is what my audience wants to hear, and the audience will either stick with them or they will leave them and maybe come back again, in the case of Bob Dylan, certainly. And I have to say that's true for me too. When I think about Patti Smith, there are periods when I just absolutely love her music and it's meant a lot to me. And there are other periods where it just feels too esoteric, too poetic maybe. And I don't mean that as a criticism of her. I feel it's my limitation that it's hard for me to get into some of the stuff because it just seems sort of too out there. But I had this great conversation with my friend Warren. Warren, if you're watching, I've been thinking about our conversation. When you think about people that you really respect in terms of musical artists, this would be true of paintings or writers, are you willing to put in a little bit more work, do some deep listening, give them the benefit of the doubt, and see if you can find your way into their music because you respect the fact that they are artists and they're people that interest you and you want to understand more. But there's just, sometimes it's great from a intellectual perspective, but from a practical perspective, sometimes things seem a bit opaque and it's hard to break through and get into some of the stuff. So again, the beginning of this does go kind of chronological and talks about her upbringing, a memoir. What is really nice and is different than just kids is she goes into quite a bit of detail about, not excessive amount of detail, but she talks about the getting together, like the kind of the chronology of how she developed as an artist. She was really a poet. She was very influenced, I think, by the beat poets, Gregory Corso, Allen Ginsberg, those kinds of things. And she herself saw herself as a writer and a poet. And then how that all progressed when she was encouraged, I think, by Sam Shepard to bring some music to that, like, have an instrument accompany her and add that extra layer. And I think she first befriended Lenny Kaye. And Lenny Kaye, again, with all these kind of threads, again, that I find so interesting. Lenny Kaye, of course, the curator of the Nuggets box set, and became the founding member of the Patti Smith group, really as the guitarist. Really just cool that she would be performing music, some of it are poetry with Lenny's music, some of it kind of free form, some of it quite structured. They play in churches, and they seem to be getting quite a following. And over time, she decided she wanted to get a band together, and that begat J.D. Doherty, Ivan Krall, and other members of the Patti Smith group. And we have what we have today, and includes with the beginning of her discography and her recorded music, which was so special. One of the things I find quite interesting, again, with these threads is I was aware, and I've seen pictures of Patti Smith with Bob Dylan circa like the mid-70s. So just around the time, I think, that she was getting going from a recording artist perspective. And so she met Dylan. Dylan apparently came into one of her shows, came backstage, and she, I think, was, very amped up after a performance. And she said she heard this voice that said, "Are there any poets in there?" And she kind of angrily said, something like, "I don't believe in poets," or something like that. And Dylan apparently smiled. It was definitely an attitude that Dylan could relate to. And they became friends. She says they weren't like, great friends, but I'm just going to read a little piece of something that I thought was really cool. So she said that she and Dylan lived on the same street for a while. In the summer, she would see him walking past her fire escape. We'd run into each other, and sometimes he'd take sometimes he'd take me wherever he was going. And so at one point, he invited her over to his place, and she said, "I sat at his feet. He picked up an acoustic guitar and played every song that would find its way onto the Desire album," one of my favorites among many favorites, Dylan. "The one that touched me the most was One More Cup of Coffee, Valley Below. That had a kind of Arabic feel. The songs were a blessing to hear, but after a while I grew restless." And again, she wasn't idolizing Dylan. She kind of saw Dylan as somebody who was in the same field as she was. She had a sense of time was short and she needed to be creating what she needed to create. So she kind of left. Dylan, this story I'd never heard before. Dylan asked her to come over and with a whole bunch of other musicians, and they sat around chatting. This was the preamble to the Rolling Thunder Review. So she was a possible participant in the Rolling Thunder Review, which I think would have been really cool. She said that he said to her that he had a kind of a full roster and that he wasn't going to include her, and he told her directly. So he didn't get a manager to tell her, he told her directly, and she really appreciated that. Rolling Thunder Review with Patti Smith, wouldn't have that been cool? As she talks about each of these albums, and we start with, of course, Horses. And one of the things that I keep forgetting is that this record was released in 1975. We think of punk often as 76, as being kind of the the birth of punk in a way. So there's no wonder that she was considered the godmother of punk, the priestess or whatever you want to say. But horses, I know some people it's not their cup of tea. I never noticed that before. It's like an upside down horse, eh? But for me, this is something else. This really left a big impression on me. And at the time, I went off and grabbed a bootleg as well, this live performance. And if you ever go onto YouTube and look at some of those, I'll put some links down below, but some of those early Patti Smith performances, she would lose herself. She would be completely lost in performance, like all great artists are, almost unaware of what's going on. They're in their own world, in their own bubble. But this is a really great bootleg. She talks about, in addition to all of the albums that she released, she talks about a couple things that I remember hearing about, I guess probably through Rolling Stone at the time, many, many years ago. One of them is that she broke some vertebrae in her neck and in her back from a fall in a concert in Florida. And her story was really interesting because she was opening up for Bob Seger of all people, and Seger's band and Seger himself didn't treat her well, which is, a common thing for a headliner to do to an opener. But she had serious concerns about the space that she was performing in, and Seger's crew had set things up. They moved them around. Anyways, long and the short of it is, it had all changed from the way it was set up before. She had no room to do her thing, to kind of do her whirling dervish kind of performative stuff. And she fell off the stage and, again, I think broke her neck and injured her back. So not that I'm a Seger fan, but I'm certainly not much of a Seger fan anymore. The other story that was interesting to me was, having been a Patti Smith fan from the beginning, from Horses, for a lot of us, we were so sort of surprised when she retreated and went to Michigan with Fred Sonic Smith, her husband and guitarist of the MC5. And I guess, many people probably just say, well, she, wanted to have a domestic life and have a family. I got a much better understanding of why that all happened. For years, he was in Detroit. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Michiganer and Detroit guy. And she was living in New York, and that's where her band was, and they were touring. And they really weren't, she was deeply in love with him. And she said right from the first meeting, she knew that he was the guy for her. And so I think that it was difficult being apart for so much. And some relationships can do fine with that distance. I think she desperately wanted to be with him and set up a home with him. And the story of her retreat to Michigan, some of the challenges, but raising kids, and that whole period. And that period was, looking at my notes here, I guess 1979 to 1994, which is when Fred Smith died of a heart attack. She had retreated. Now, it wasn't that she hadn't recorded anything. They ran into some financial challenges, and I think that in part spurred them to do a record together. And they did this record, Patti Smith. You'll notice it's not the Patti Smith group. Interestingly, of course, the cover of Horses is a Robert Mapplethorpe photo. This also a Robert Mapplethorpe photo. But this record was released in 1988. The album that preceded it was this record, Wave. And this one was released in 79. So there's 9 years of, no full-length releases from Patti Smith. And this one was the Patti Smith group. So when she recorded this album with her band and toured, she says in the book she knew that was it for the band. That was it. She was done because she was going to be moving to Detroit and to be with her love, with Fred Sonic Smith. This record, a very good record, was a single off the record, People Have the Power. I will say that I want to call out that as, to me, what I consider to be an absolute anthem. It should be an anthem for our times now, to stand up to things, injustice and things that you don't feel are right. And also just, I remember listening to this record when I was going through a very challenging time, and when I had a breakthrough, I remember listening to this over and over again, and this became my soundtrack, People Have the Power. I find it very uplifting. Not much of a success as a single, but sometimes things have a second or a third life, and I know it has had some resurgence in interest, partly because I think people find it a sort of an anthemic gathering of people who share values, and I think it's great. People Have the Power, Patti Smith. So I wanted to just sort of come on and say how much I really enjoyed this book. I really thought it was good. It's not a long read, but it's a very good read. And if you're a Patti Smith fan, I really recommend that you give it a read. I think you'd really enjoy it. Just a few other sort of thoughts here. This may be the record that I listen to the most of Patti Smith's, the Horses being kind of the door opening, and I love it. But this album, Easter, to me was just exquisite. Till Victory, which is amazing, Because the Night, the track. And she talks about how that song came to her through Jimmy Iovine and Bruce Springsteen, writing I think some of the music, and then she wrote the lyrics. And the lyrics, Love Is the Ring on the Telephone, was about her waiting for Fred to call from Michigan. And again, back to that whole thing, living in two different cities, these people were deeply in love with each other and could only spend, brief time together because of their busy schedules, and hers in particular. And this notion that it was so expensive to do even a long distance phone call. And so like once a week, they would have a scheduled phone call. And Fred had not called at the designated time. And she was worried about him, and she was thinking about him. And that's where the lyrics for Because the Night came from. Apparently, people were just horrified by the armpit hair here. I think we've gotten better about that. I know that, is it Rianne from Wet Leg? She's visible armpit hair. Doesn't seem to be an issue. It's kind of a bit more female empowerment. But, Patti paved the way in many ways, different ways. But another iconic photo of Patti Smith. So Bread of Angels, definitely worth reading. This is a great compilation. If you don't have this, this is wonderful. Covers her career all the way to, well, this is 2002, so it doesn't go all the way through her whole career, but certainly a big part of kind of the more well-known part of her career, Land. On disc, I've also got Gone Again, and this was the record that she recorded after Fred's passing. Some really nice stuff on here as well. And if I'm not mistaken, she had a story about finding her real father. She didn't know till later in life that she was, her father that raised her was not her blood father. So that's always a pretty interesting experience for people to have to go through. And she talks a bit about that. But this one here called Gung Ho. I saw her and the Patti Smith group on this tour, and that was great. It's the only one time that I've seen her in concert, and I felt very lucky. It wasn't like the most incredible concert ever, but it was really very enjoyable. I think the other thing that this book really reveals is her deep friendships with people in the music and writing fields. So she had a strong connection with William Burroughs, with Gregory Corso, friendships with Tom Verlaine. So that's it. A little appreciation for and an immersion in Patti Smith. Love you, Patti. Carpe diem, motherfuckers.